Welcome to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Granting Stream webinar. This webinar will help you to understand what it takes to know you're making an impact. Further, Liz will explore how to build shared measurement strategies in your collective work. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Liz Weaver is the Director for the Learning Center and Tamarac's Vice President. Liz helps initiatives develop their frameworks of change, supports and guides their project and helps connect them with other comprehensive community collaborations. She has also been director for the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was recognized with the Canadian Urban Institute David Crombie Leadership Award in 2009. In her career, Liz has held leadership positions with YWCA Hamilton, Volunteer Hamilton, and Volunteer Canada. I'll now turn it over to Liz.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and hi everybody. Welcome to the webinar on shared measurement in collective impact. Really excited that you're joining us today. This webinar is going to try to accomplish the following goals. We're going to quickly review the core conditions of collective impact. We're going to actually focus on how to build a shared measurement approach for your collective impact initiative, and we're going to share with you some examples of groups that have been using collective impact and shared measurement and what they're learning, and we're also going to share with you some tools that can help deepen your understanding of collective impact and shared measurement. So if we can move to the next slide, Stephanie, that would be great. So we always begin these webinars with just a little bit of a refresher on collective impact. So those of you that have participated in the webinar, the series of webinars, the first couple of slides will seem really familiar to you. For those of you that are new, you'll just be able to refresh your understanding of collective impact. This is a definition that we like at Tamarac and at the Ontario Trillium Foundation. This is really that collective impact is a commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving specific social problem using a structured form of collaboration. And there are a couple things in here. You know, the whole idea of an important set of important actors from different sectors is important. The specific social problem that you're focusing on is important, and you'll learn why when we talk about shared measurement. And the idea that it is a structured form of collaboration. So those are critical in terms of really trying to understand collective impact. Next slide, Steph. What it's not. What we are learning at Tamarac, and I know that the folks at the Ontario Trillium Foundation are learning as well, is that it's not collaboration as usual. It's really saying, how do we bring a diverse number of actors together, not necessarily the usual suspects, but people that might, be engaged with the problem in unique kind of ways, the business community, the faith community, education sector. So how do we really work across sectors, individuals from the community with the experience of the issue? So that's where it's not collaboration as usual. It's also not a single sector approach. It doesn't focus on individual programs or short-term impacts. It's really looking to what are the things that we need to do in our communities to drive large-scale cross-sector change forward. Next slide. As we know, the framework, so the kind of way that collective impact is formed is that there are 3 preconditions and 5 conditions. These are the 3 preconditions. Influential champions, urgency of the issue, and adequate resources. And influential champions is really talking about who are the right people that we need to have at the table. Urgency of the issue actually ties really nicely into our topic today around shared measurement, because part of what you'll see in the shared measurement process is that we can understand urgency by data. And so the data tells us, who's experiencing that problem or opportunity in our community, what's the depth of that experience. And so that really then ties into, okay, so, once we know the scale and the scope of the problem from a data perspective, that allows us to then identify some of those population level measures that we want to drive change forward in. So urgency is really a precondition, but very nicely linked to the shared measurement condition. And then the final precondition is adequate resources. And we know, particularly from a shared measurement perspective, that you might need additional resources to help you measure the change that you want to see. Next slide. The framework has, the Collective Impact Framework has these 5 core conditions, as we all know. The first one is common agenda, where everybody has a shared vision for change, and that's the folks around your table or the folks that are connected to your collective impact work, and that they agree to solve it through, you know, strategies or actions that they're going to really tackle the change around this common agenda. Shared measurement we're going to talk about a lot, but it's really about collecting data and measuring results consistently so that all of your participants know that you are actually making progress and that you're holding each other accountable. Mutually reinforcing activities are those activities or strategies that are driving your common agenda forward. Continuous communications is communications not only to each other around the collective impact table, but also to your community and engagement in your community. And then backbone support or backbone infrastructure is really that kind of support that moves collective impact from the side of your desk right to the middle of your desk. Next slide. So today we're going to really focus on shared measurement. And I think the key question of shared measurement is really, are we making an impact or are we just howling at the moon, which these coyotes seem to be doing. Next slide. Shared measurement is part of a larger learning system within collective impact. And I think it's important to situate the kind of shared measurement system within all the things that you want to try to do around evaluation. So it's really looking at, you know, how are we going to collect results, collect the data and results, and that's what our shared measurement system, and then how are we going to evaluate the collective impact effort as a whole. If you could hit the next button, Steph. So evaluation refers to the range of activities that involve the planned, purposeful, and systematic collection of information about those activities, the characteristics, and the outcomes of the collective impact initiative. Next button. And shared measurement is that common set of indicators that the group has agreed to that will track progress towards goals. Next slide. So some of the things that you want to ask in terms of shared measurement is, what progress are we making? And then the second question is that it's not only about the progress that you're making, but you also want to make sure that the information or as you look at the information, that does it help you make better decisions about, you know, the initiatives, the strategies, the overall impact that you're making from a collective impact lens. And so, you know, as we think about collective impact in terms of the common agenda and the mutually reinforcing activities, as you begin to go into the work of mutually reinforcing activities, you'll see that not all activities will lead to the same level of impact. And so you want to begin to say, you know, what progress are we making on these mutually reinforcing activities, and which of those activities are leading us to greater and greater impact. Next slide. So there are things to think about in terms of developing the shared measurement system. There are the elements of design. You know, and in the design, you want to think about what is our shared vision for the system. So if we're going to have a set of indicators that our partners are going to use to track progress over time, what's our vision for that system? Is it going to be related to the broader goals? Is it going to be related to the theory of change or the roadmap that we've designed? And we'll show some examples of that. What's the current state of knowledge and data? So who in our community is already collecting data that might be relevant to us. So for example, if you're focused on high school, improving high school graduation rates, for example, who's collecting the data around that? And so how often is that data collected? Is that data collected at the level that you want to work in? So is it at the neighborhood level? Is it at the, the community level? Is it at the provincial level? So you really have to identify a set of kind of, in your design, a set of kind of markers around the current state of data and how accessible it is. How are you going to structure participation, and what are the metrics? Similarly, the next step is really around development. So are you going to use a web-based platform to collect the data, or are you going to use something that is more paper-based? So what's the system that you're going to put into place in terms of collecting the data and reporting the data and actually synthesizing the results? And then the final element of the shared measurement system is the notion of deploying. So then once we've collected the data, we've synthesized the results, how do we integrate this learning aspect into shared measurement? So how many times are we going to create learning forums? How are we going to use this data for continuous improvement? What are the ongoing infrastructure questions around a shared measurement system that we have to put into play? So this is actually a really nice slide, kind of really focusing on the shared measurement system. Now, we've seen at Tamarack shared measurement systems that are, low-tech, paper-driven, all the way through to very high-tech, very sophisticated systems that have had lots of investment. And so really at your collective impact table, you really want to have a conversation about, okay, in our shared measurement system, how low-tech or high-tech can we go, and what are the resources? But the basic principles on this slide relate to all the different kinds of systems. Next slide. So here's an example of the design of a collective impact approach using a kind of a shared measurement approach. So this is an initiative of childhood obesity in the Dallas area, Dallas-Fort Worth area. So in the first phase, they've identified their measures around the process of working together. And this is really focused on the 5 conditions of collective impact. And what they're really focusing on in the early phase is to what degree are we, as a collective impact initiative, really embedding these conditions of collective impact into our design? The second phase is really starting to look at some measures that look at changes in systems and then changes for individuals and families. And you can see how this group has broken it down to say, the partners around the table, is our professional practice changing? Are we increasing community infrastructure? And what are some early policy changes that we're seeing? And then for changes in individual and families, it's really looking at awareness, knowledge, and belief and behaviors. And then finally, the third phase is where you're looking at indicators, but you may not see the progress in, let's say, the first year or the second year. It takes maybe 3 to 5 years to get to the population level changes. And so I think this is a kind of a neat way of looking at shared measurement to say, okay, we're going to develop our shared measurement strategy, but in the strategy, in the first year and in the first and second years, we're really going to focus on changes in the process, and then in second year, maybe changes in systems and individual behaviors, and then move towards the larger scale population change. Next slide. So some of the challenges in terms of developing shared measurement systems and shared measurement approaches is that there can be difficulty in coming to agreement on common outcomes and indicators. When I was working at the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, we brought together all the people in the community who were collecting data that we thought was relevant to our poverty work. And we came up with 600 different indicators, when you brought the school board and public health and the city of Hamilton and folks at the Alford Center and folks at the university, you brought a really broad swath of people together. We were overwhelmed by the amount of data that was being collected, and it took us a pretty long time. It took us about a year to actually narrow down to a subset of indicators that was relevant and really met the needs of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And it might be the case, depending on the issue that you're working on, that might be a similar case. So there can be difficulty in coming to agreement. There might be concerns about the relative performance of that measure across different providers working in the same space. And so, sometimes what one organization collects and another organization collects and reports on, there might be differences in how that happens, and so you want to have a conversation about that. Another challenge is the capacity that you might have in terms of data analysis within your participating organizations. And so one of the things that we suggest is, setting up an evaluation group where you can bring in some people who have the data analysis expertise, who might be willing to share that expertise and mentor you along the way. There might be challenges around aligning with funders who are asking for different sorts of measures in their reporting requirements. And of course, if you go for the large-scale online high-tech shared measurement system, there are certainly time and cost in terms of developing that system. Next slide. So here are some challenges in data collection, and here's an example, right? So you can see that there are some system indicators in this case. The challenges are the data sources, the frequency of their collections, whether the information is collected or not, who collects that information, and can they disaggregate it if you're working at a very small scale, if you're working at a neighborhood scale, but the data is only collected at, let's say, the county scale or the city scale, then the data might not necessarily be relevant for you. Next slide. So here are some keys to successful strategies in shared measurement. One is to really, talk with the funders, both in your community or the funders that you might have around your collective impact table. See what their requirements are, see what data they're collecting, because they also do collect data, or see if they might have some additional resources that can help you with setting up a shared measurement system. In Canada, we have a couple of examples of shared measurement systems where we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. So the Ontario Foundation is working at a national level with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, and there are some examples. They have provincial data around that subset of indicators. So is that something that you can look to? In other communities, you have community foundations that are putting out vital signs reports. And so I would look to existing data groups in your community or existing reports in your community and say, is there data being collected there that can be helpful to us or useful to us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? Next, push the button. The other key element for success in shared measurement is this idea of broad and open engagement. So, this is really talking, as we did in Hamilton, talking to everybody that we could think about that was collecting data of one sort or another, and really asking the question, what data are they collecting, and then, are they willing to share that with us? Next, the third key element of success is around infrastructure. So, really having open conversations about what kind of infrastructure is needed. And then, Stephanie, the final one is really to create these pathways. So, you might start off with a paper kind of approach to your shared measurement and start to build your pathway towards higher levels of improvement and more kind of bringing in more and more technology. In some communities, I just also wanted to mention that in some communities in Canada, there are data consortiums. So there already are groups in your community of funders and university partners, and there might be a social planning council. So ask the question, the city might be involved in them, so ask the question, is there a data consortium that I can already tap into? Next slide. So here are some tricks and tips. When you're thinking about shared measurement, you want to really limit the number of indicators to a manageable number. Sometimes when you have too many measures, it just gets unmanageable, and you want to establish a set of criteria, and further on in the presentation, you'll see a group that actually has set up some criteria. You want to collect the data, and you want to figure out how you're going to present it. Is it going to be an infographic? Is it going to be a dashboard? You know, how do you bring it out into the community? How do you make sense of it? And then you also want to leverage existing efforts and expertise in your community, as I've already talked about. So next slide, Steph. So here I'm going to share with you 3 case studies of shared measurement approaches. So the first one is the Calgary Homeless Foundation, and they've gone for the platinum version of shared measurement. The second case study is the Roadmap Project, which is a project working on educational outcomes in Seattle. And then the third one is very much a neighborhood-based approach to collective impact in improving outcomes for children and youth in the Magnolia Place community in Los Angeles. Next slide. So Calgary's lessons. The Calgary Homeless Foundation received investment from the province of Alberta to set up a shared measurement system that includes 50 partners across the city of Calgary that are trying to end homelessness in Calgary. And so here are some of the lessons that I pulled from a presentation that they'd done. And some of the lessons on design are that the shared measurement process led them to rethink their implementation and helped really structure their collective impact initiative overall. That they really recognized in their process that they had to be collaborative, that they had to be transparent, and that they really didn't need to make the technology that they were using accessible and relevant to all. And so when they started to work with, small, medium, and large-sized organizations across the community, they had to recognize that not all organizations had the same capacity, and they really had to make sure that the capacity was shared and equitable between big and small organizations and agencies across the community. And that they also really dealt with the issue of privacy. Privacy, because they were dealing with individuals who are very vulnerable, privacy concerns really had to be addressed as part of the design process that they use. So I think there are some really important lessons if you're going to move towards a shared measurement system that is where folks are sharing data across a central platform. Next slide, Stephanie. In terms of the Roadmap Project in Seattle, they're a cradle-to-career educational initiative, and they're working across a number of different neighborhoods in Seattle. Next slide. So what they did was they formed work groups. Again, they were looking to that kind of inclusion process in terms of their evaluation and shared measurement process. So they decided to form work groups in the different areas. They developed a set of criteria to identify and prioritize indicators. The work groups met to calibrate the indicators across their pathway. They developed a short list of indicators, and then they have tracked progress and refined the indicators over time. Next slide. And so here's some of the criteria that they used in terms of their indicator selection. So I think that, you know, what's helpful here is the idea of setting up a set of criteria. So, you know, they said, okay, in order for this indicator to be useful to us, it had to link to our ultimate goal or to the sub-goals. So it had to be a valid measure. It just wasn't, you know, a nice measure. It had to be a valid and linked measure. It had to be easily understandable to local stakeholders. The data had to be produced by a trusted source. It had to be comparable because they were working across a number of different school districts. The indicator had to be comparable across the school districts. If you were working across multiple neighborhoods, you'd want to have an indicator that was comparable across multiple neighborhoods similarity. It had to be affordable, available, so consistent over time, and disaggregated by the geography that they were looking at. And that they were also looking for trend data. So not only were they looking for when they were starting their initiative, but they were looking backwards and forwards in terms of trend data as well. Then the final thing that they identified here was that it should be able to be influenced to a significant degree by local action. So it wasn't just an indicator that was sitting out there. It was, you know, were the strategies that the roadmap project identified, were those strategies able in some way to be influenced by local action, to influence the indicator. Okay, next slide. And here's what you can see in terms of the roadmap indicators. So their pathway is healthy and ready for kindergarten, supported and successful in school, graduate from high school and career ready, and earn a college degree or credential. And so you can see the indicators that they've selected in terms of this. This is their first level of indicators. Next slide. And what they've been able to see is they started off, so they were looking at trend data, and so they started off with a baseline report and have built from this baseline report going forward. So if you were to go on to the Seattle Roadmap Project website, you'd be able to see where they started off, and you can now see their progress over time. So that's actually a really important part of shared measurement system is what is the baseline that you're working from right now, and then how are you moving your work forward? Next slide. So the final case study is Magnolia Place. It's a local community initiative. Their vision is that everyone in Magnolia Place, in the Magnolia Place community, works together to ensure that they and their neighbors live well and prosper. You can see that they're really working at a community level change model that builds resilience at the individual, family, and social levels. I love their visual, which is, you know, here's what we're working towards in terms of the leaves of our tree, but we're really focused on also building strong roots across our community. So it's a lovely visual in terms of their collective impact approach. Next slide. They have a dashboard that really tracks progress over time. So, and this dashboard they use to really measure and to report out on their measures. So they have measures that are at the bottom that focus on real-time improvement in services and programs, and then they also track towards longer-term outcomes, whether it's developmental progress in kindergarten or reading proficiency or grade 3. So they are doing a mix of really looking at how the programmatic, the mutually reinforcing activities are impacting improvements in real time in terms of services and supports, and then also looking at the higher level population-based indicators. Next slide. So the way that they have structured their learning process, and this is, I think, what I wanted to bring out in this case study, is that they're really looking at what are we trying to accomplish together, how will we know if this change is an improvement, and what changes can we make that will result in improvements. And so they very much have brought in this idea of act, plan, study, act, plan, and do. So it's all kind of working together. So they look at their results both at the programmatic level, and they're also looking at their larger term results and really continuously looking at systems improvements. And they've identified 3 levels of change that they're particularly interested in: changes in the system overall, changes that happen across organizations, and then changes that happen within individual organizations and services as they're delivered. And so if you think back to the slide early on where, you know, it was the collective impact, it was the approach that said, first we're going to measure to what degree we're embedding the conditions of collective impact into our work. Then we're going to look at, you know, some of those systems changes, and then some of those individual child and family changes, and then we're going to look at population level changes. They've in fact brought that into their design of their process. Next slide. So some of the lessons that Magnolia Place has learned in their shared measurement process is that the real-time nature of data provides a way to test hypothesis and to learn about, you know, what is working and what is not working. And so they, you know, if you look at some of their measures, and we'll send a copy of their dashboard in the post email mail out. But if you look at them, they're looking at, in some cases, month-by-month changes. And so that's really letting them know real time what is happening in their community, in their neighborhoods, and then how is that factoring up, and where are some opportunities for improvement. So they have a model for improvement that really provides some discipline to them. So the partners attend meetings, they get access to the data, and they also are coached in terms of interpreting and learning from the data. They also focus on tapping into their partners' knowledge, expertise, and creativity, so some of that shared sense-making that is so integral in the shared measurement process. And then finally, they're looking for strategic alignment, and some of the lessons that the more that individuals and groups are engaged in the shared measurement process, the greater buy-in they have to really working on the strategic outcomes of a collective impact effort. And so I think that that's really interesting. So, you know, how do you build that strategic alignment into your collective impact work? Next slide. So some of the steps in the design process, these are just some of the how-tos for you, is to really think about what is your shared vision, what is that criteria, how are you going to, you know, establish kind of the rules around the data, how the data is shared, how decisions are made about the data, what are the working groups around it, how do you conduct due diligence around it, what's the metrics that you're going to select, and then how do you take that kind of conversation and vet it with and use it as an opportunity to engage a broader stakeholder community, so that when you go out to your community and you say, you know, our collective impact approach is about this change, here are the metrics that we've selected, do they seem like they're the right set of metrics? And if we were to make progress on these metrics, would you think, community, that we were actually doing something significant for our community? So there's really important elements to consider here in terms of these steps. Next slide. So some of the steps for learning, and these are ones that we heard as we went through the 3 case studies. We heard from the Calgary Homeless Foundation, and we heard from the Magnolia Place, that these are important steps in terms of building learning and continuous improvement into your shared measurement. So you want to form teams for learning, or you might even want to do as they did at Magnolia Place, you might want to take the data to the whole group and say, okay, so what are we learning from this data? What's the experience? You know, what are some of the patterns that we're starting to see? How do we make sense of this? At Tamarack, with our vibrant community partners, we do this quite often. So we'll collect a subset of data, and then we'll really engage our partners in terms of looking at the data and trying to make sense of it and really starting to identify the patterns that are happening. You want to review the data that's being tracked. You want to make sure that as your collective impact initiatives evolve over, are these sets of measures still the most relevant measures to you? You want to discuss the challenges and the successes of the work. You probably want to figure out where the changes are happening and then implement those changes more broadly, and then figure out what is the data telling you where you can actually spread changes across the initiative. And there's a story I tell a lot about when I was doing this work in Hamilton, and we had seen some progress, a decline in the rate of the number of people in Hamilton that were living in poverty, and we were quite excited about that. But when we actually started to look at that data more soberly, we saw that it was seniors that were moving out of poverty, and our focus was on children and youth. And so we said, oh, that's really interesting. So what's happening for seniors in our community, and why are they moving out of poverty more quickly? And one of the things that we learned was, at the time, there was a tax helping seniors fill in their tax forms so that they could get all the tax benefits that were accrued to them. And we thought, oh, that's a really cool strategy. What if we used it with low-income families so that they could get all their tax benefits that accrued to them, particularly low-income families that had children. And we had in Hamilton a lot of newcomer low-income families. So, you know, it's really interesting to look at the data, to kind of, with your partners, break it down a little bit, try to go, oh, why did that happen? What are the patterns there? And then could we use those patterns to improve the work that we're doing? Next slide. So we want to point you to a really great resource in terms of the whole rubric of evaluation and shared measurement. FSG, a number of years ago, I think 2 years ago, put together a set of 3 guides called Guides to Evaluating Collective Impact. They're very helpful guides in terms of, you know, what's the big idea behind collective impact? How is collective impact as an initiative really driving towards this idea of policy and systems change? And then what are some indicators, both in the design of collective impact in your initiative, in the behavioral and policy change elements of your shared measurement, and then what are some indicator areas that you might want to consider in terms of population level indicators. So these guides are really helpful. The first guide is the big picture guide. The second guide really provides some real-time case studies that are quite interesting. And the third guide takes you through the process on a step-by-step basis and gives you some proxy indicators that I think can be very helpful. To those of you that are new to collective impact, they're downloadable, so you can download them and you can share them widely across your collective impact teams as you're beginning to kind of dip your toe into shared measurement. So that's the content of the presentation. I know that someone asked a question in the chat box about whether the slides would be presented, and yes, they will be sent to you after the presentation, as will a recording of this. I think Stephanie, what we'll do is maybe go to Doug next, and then we'll come back to questions and answers. So Doug, if you're ready to tell us a little bit about Trillium, this is part of the capacity building services that Trillium is investing in around collective impact. So why don't you tell us a little bit more, Doug, about collective impact and the Ontario Trillium Foundation?
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much, Liz. I appreciate that. I'm not going to take up too much time because what I am going to do is we're going to flip through a couple slides and then send you to our website where most of the information is. But for those of us that don't know, for those of you that don't know who we are, we're an agency of the provincial government that receives a significant amount of money yearly to invest in communities. Collective Impact is one of our investment streams that we have, along with what we call grow and seed streams for funding. And we use those, as it says on the slide, to build healthy and vibrant communities across a number of action areas that we have. And our collective impact work also aligns with those action areas. So we are fairly new to the collective impact world, and we are learning as we go as well too. We're about a year into this and made a number of kind of early stage investments with Tamarack as a partner to really help and guide us through. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. If we can just flip to the next slide for a second. So again, it is one of our granting streams that I suspect a lot of people on the line are fairly knowledgeable about collective impact, and yeah, we're interested in investing in it through our 3 stages, which I believe are up on our website, and we've got some more information coming soon on our website that will further define what it is that we do. And the next slide, please. Thanks very much. So I would encourage anybody that goes. Our website is really built to have all the information that you need for both collective impact and our other granting streams. And there's certainly within the collective impact piece, it is an evolving piece of our site where we will have more information coming soon on tools and resources, our relationship with Tamarack, the webinars, all of those kinds of things. So the first thing that I would suggest is that you go and become familiar with our website at as you can see there, at otf.ca, and reach out to us. Unlike our other granting streams, for those of you that are familiar with that, those streams, our collective impact stream is one that we are involved in with you. The first thing you should do is check our website. The next is give us a shout. And a staff member, either a program manager from your area or a strategy lead, that's what I do, along with other kind of subject matter expertise people here in Trillium, will work with you on collective impact, unlike our other streams where it's kind of more of a separation. So Liz, I'm just going to leave it at that with the information up. Again, please go to our website, please call our support center and contact us if you think you've got something that you want to talk about in collective impact.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. So now we're going to throw it open to everybody that's on the line. I think, Stephanie, we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I wondered, Stephanie, if there are any questions that have come forward.
Yeah, definitely. So
Hi, Liz.
thank you, Doug, so much for that. And Liz, I hope you got a chance to get a glass of water because that was a lot of content, a lot of talking, and we already do have some questions rolling in. So the first one comes from Allison, and she asks, can you talk specifically about how some of these examples of initiatives overcame the data sharing concerns around privacy? And then Rebecca followed that up with a similar question, just asking you how you can legally share personal data collected by one organization to the others around the table regarding privacy laws around sharing data.
Yeah, and I think, if I were to dive a little bit deeper into the privacy question, I'd probably call the folks at the Calgary Homeless Foundation because they're the ones that I think are the best example of really looking at shared information across a shared platform, right, where all the different organizations key in their data, and they are dealing with a very vulnerable population. I think what I have heard in the presentation that I attended from the Calgary Homeless Foundation is that they needed to come up with a set of criteria that their partners could agree to in terms of sharing data and also respecting privacy, not only privacy of the participants in their programs or the participants accessing their programs and services, but also privacy in terms of, the partners around the Calgary Homelessness Foundation table. So they set up a set of criteria. In some cases, with other groups that I've worked with, they have looked at aggregating the data in a certain way that it doesn't reflect an individual's experience, or in some cases an individual school's experience. And so, you know, how can they get data shared at a level where that individual organization or the school is not reflected, but you're aggregating the data across communities? I think that's a really important question for the groups to consider in their conversation, and really talking to your partners and saying, okay, so what are the privacy constraints that we have to pay attention to as we're doing this work? And you know, I could, Stephanie, I could maybe contact the folks at the Calgary Homeless Foundation and see if they're willing to share the criteria that they put into place so that we can send that out to folks.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, because there was a couple other questions that were quite similar to that, so I think that'd be really beneficial. We do have another question here from Rihanna. She asks, how do you recommend differentiating between contributions to impact, i.e., how do you discern which actions are contributing to which impact? In some cases, this may be obvious, but there are many factors that contribute to change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and there are factors that are completely external to the work that you might be doing in terms of, you know, whether it's poverty reduction, for example. You might be working really hard in your community around poverty reduction, and then, you know, we have something happen where the market drops out, or we go into some kind of a financial crisis. So there are those external forces. I think the lesson that they learned from the Seattle Roadmap Project, or one of the criteria that they had in their indicator design, was the link between their intervention, their mutually reinforcing activity, and the ability to influence that indicator. And so you want to be able to, in some cases that's easier to make those links, in other cases it can be more challenging, but the closer you can make those links, I think the more effective you can be in reporting out on, you know, your contribution. The other thing that I think is really important is to track contribution. So to track, you know, to what degree did the Collective Impact Initiative contribute to that change? And so if you're thinking about a longer term change from a policy perspective, you want to kind of go back and say, okay, so what are the number of things that we did at our Collective Impact Initiative that actually drove that change forward? So really tracking that. And then finally, in the Evaluating Community Impact work that Mark Cabaj and I do, workshop that Mark Cabaj and I do, we actually do talk a lot about contribution analysis, and there are some tools out there around contribution analysis. You could do a rating scale approach, which would be to ask a variety of different partners the degree to which you think that your Collective Impact Initiative contributed to that change on a rating scale. And that has been used by some of our vibrant communities. And they actually, as they did that, they were able to engage their partners in, you know, observing their work and giving them some feedback on their work. And they actually, in one case, were quite surprised at the rating that they got. They thought that their contribution was midpoint, and their community partners actually rated them higher than they thought. So there are some tools out there that can really look at contribution as well.
Great, thanks Liz. We have one more question here that I think we have time for. This one comes from Denise. She asks, could you explain how the actions, system changes, and population level changes are connected, i.e. how to track attribution?
Well, so that's attribution, contribution, that same question that I just answered. So it is, when we were doing the work in Hamilton, we developed a tool called an outcomes diary. And so we had 3 levels of change, not unlike Magnolia Place, where it was changes for individuals in our community, changes in how the community was working differently together, and then changes in the policy and systems. And we tracked over time the shifts that we were observing in the community where the roundtable played a role in those shifts and in those changes. And so that allowed us, and we did this kind of on a regular basis, like a weekly basis. We sent it out to our partners and said, here are the shifts that we're observing. Are you observing the same kinds of shifts? And we were really quite focused on what contribution did the roundtable make to those shifts. And the outcomes diary really helped us begin to understand patterns. It helped us begin to understand attribution and contribution. And it also helped us begin to understand what was having the most impact and what were some of the activities that we were doing that were nice to have activities, but weren't necessarily activities that have impact. So we'll send you a copy of the Outcomes Diary resource at a glance as one of the tools in the post email so that you can take a look at that. There's another collective impact initiative in Vancouver that's focused on, or in Victoria that's focused on children's well-being, and they're using the Outcomes Diary as well to track their progress over time. So it's kind of interesting. We'll have some more data of how that diary can be helpful. So now over to you, Stephanie, for the final few moments.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. I'd just like to wrap up today by telling you about some exciting stuff that's happening at Tamarack in the next coming months. Mainly our big Community Change Institute. This is happening in Toronto from September 26th to 30th. It's a 5-day event, and it'll feature 4 world-renowned speakers, 40 workshops, and over 250 changemakers from across the globe. So we'd love to see you all there. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to myself at stephanie@tamarackcommunity.ca. Not only that, but we have a couple more events this fall, mainly our ECI in Hamilton, November 15th to 17th. And then we have a few more OTF webinars and some community conversations leading up to our big Community Change Impact in Toronto. So again, we'll circulate all of these slides so you guys can take a look at those dates. And we'd love to see you on those webinars and as well in Toronto this fall. So thank you so much for joining us, and check your emails for the recording and slides and anything that Liz had referred to during this webinar. And we appreciate all the comments and questions. It really helped make this a dynamic webinar, so thank you so much.